like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and waters where we're working today. I'm working from Gomeroi country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Lana Andrews. I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Facilitator for Northwest Local Land Services. And today we bring you this webinar to provide information on the possible and potential impacts of variable nitrogen prices and ways you can adapt to some of that variability. Today's webinar is supported by Local Land Services through funding from the Australian Government's Natural Heritage Trust and the Climate Smart Agriculture Program. Before we begin, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you have any questions throughout our webinar, if you could just pop them in the chat and we can ask them of the presenters. And today's webinar is being recorded, so you will all receive a link. All right, let's move on to our first speaker. So we have James Hagan from the Queensland Department of Primary Industries. So James is a senior economist and he's based in Toowoomba. He has over 20 years experience in broadacre cropping, and he's currently working on the GRDC supported Northern Farming Systems project. So using data from this project and others, he'll be discussing the impact of urea pricing on farming systems performance. So I'll pass over to you, James.
Thanks, Lana. Let me know when you can see that and we'll get cracking.
Thanks, James. All good.
All right. So as Lana said, I'm on the GRDC Farming Systems project, which is a joint project with New South Wales DPI, CSIRO, the Queensland Department. And we've got a series of sites across the Northern Grains region with different management practices at each of those sites. So it's starts with we've got a baseline system, which is your typical sorghum, chickpea, wheat rotation in most of those locations. And then there's alterations to that system with, a high nutrition targeting a higher yield decile. I think the baseline target's the 50th decile, so average yield or median yield. And then we have some triggers that we use to try adjust that system to look at farm system performance. And so we've got a higher intensity system, which means we sow on less stored soil water, a lower intensity system, which means we need a full profile before we sow, a higher legume system, which means legume crop every second year, and a higher diversity system, which is really looking higher disease breaks, so a high variation of crops. And I'm going to use some data from these systems and these sites to have a look at the impact of nitrogen pricing on farming systems, and if there are anything we can do in response to high prices. But before I get into that, I'll just do a little bit of context, and I'm sure most of you are across of what's happening. And you'll see on this slide, this is our last 20 years of wheat and urea pricing. And you'll see, I hope you can see it, about 2021, we were in a similar situation before where we had, Ukraine-Russia war breakout, impacts to gas, impacts to wheat. And so we had this big spike in nitrogen pricing or urea pricing, accompanied by a large spike in wheat pricing or grain pricing in general. So we had this spike, and it actually ended up being fairly over $500 a tonne at stages there. This time around, we've got a different scenario in that the world's got lots of grains stored. So we've got starting with high stocks. We've still got this supply shock to energy pricing, and we're seeing urea prices get up to that $1,300 a tonne. At least it was last week. I think it was $12.80 I could get at Brisbane Port, if you can get it. But we're not seeing the corresponding increase in grain prices because we've got the large global stocks, and the direct impact at the moment isn't in a major grain exporter. We do know that all our markets are essentially linked to energy. So whilst the grain price hasn't responded yet, we would expect it to increase over time as the attractiveness of converting grains to biofuel pulls some of that grain out of the market. And just showing how quickly these things have moved. I did a GRDC update on the 3rd of March, and I'd only finished the presentation, I think, on the 28th of February or 26th of February, something like that, the weekend before. And it might have been the 27th. The graph here is Singapore diesel and petrol prices. The top two lines is what we want to pay attention to. We've gone from about 130 a barrel to 350 a barrel for diesel. This is essentially diesel. It's AV gas or gas oil at 10% sulfur or 10 ppm sulfur. And that equates to about, divide that number by 159 essentially to get the dollar a litre. So it's about $2.20 a litre diesel. In the span of a month, we've almost tripled in our energy price for diesel. So that's just showing how fast this thing has moved. That's 2030s yesterday. So that's where we're up to there. So I guess that's the context in where we're trying to make these decisions. We've gone from, I think about 800 ton urea to 1,300 plus, and if we can get it, and trying to make how does that work in our farming system. So I'm going to jump straight into some rough numbers on nitrogen application, which is $1 a ton urea to $1 a kilo of nitrogen is our left graph here. So, if we're at $7.50 a ton urea, we're paying about $1.60 a kilo of nitrogen. At $1,500 a ton urea, or $12.50, we're paying $2.70 or $3.30 a kilo for nitrogen. Now, we know rough back of the hand calculations, 40 kilos of nitrogen equals a ton of grain in terms of that conversion. So even at $3.30 a kilo for nitrogen, that's times that by 40, we're looking at about $140 for a ton, right? For a ton of yield. So you're paying $140 and you're getting somewhere between $140 and $180 back. So in terms of additional profit, so $300 for a ton of grain or $360 for a ton of grain, take the $140 for nitrogen off that. Now, we've got some work from Mike Bell and Yui from University of Queensland. I think Lana's got a link to pop in the chat there that shows, our nitrogen recovery rates in year of application can range from 80% to 20% or lower at times. But that we know over the long term, the average sort of recovery rate for nitrogen or urea applied in winter cropping systems is about 80%. We lose about 20% of it. And that means over the year, from the year of application, we typically recover maybe 40% in the year of application, then a bit more the following year, and there's a tiny bit left in year 3 usually. For summer applied urea, it's about 60% is what we sort of recover. So we can convert that then. So we're assuming $3.60 a ton grain prices. If we assume that, then we go down to our urea pricing here. So even at $1,500 a ton urea, we're still expecting to make an additional $200 to $140 a hectare if we're nitrogen limited by putting that urea on for 80 and 60% recoveries. But what that does mean is that it's starting to run the risk of, we have a below expected recovery rate, and we're starting to run into the risk of it not being worth doing at that 1,500 plus range. That's pretty much where I'm going to leave the general nitrogen story before I go into looking at what the impact of these changing in prices has on the farming systems data and what that means. If anyone is interested in more just nitrogen market analysis, nitrogen pricing, what they're currently doing, the guys from episode 3, so Andrew Whitelaw, cover it really well. They've got some blogs, so it's just episode3.net. Highly recommend. Really easy to understand and give you some indication on what's going on there. But I'll swap now and just going to move into the what increased nitrogen pricing. If we go back and say, look, we've had nitrogen pricing for our farming systems project for 10 years of data. If we go back and put, this nitrogen price we've got now over the top, what would that mean? And what's the impacts? So I'll just keep going there. So to start with, this is a breakdown of our variable costs across the entire project. And so that blue bar there is our nutrition component of our variable costs on across our major farming systems that we're identifying. So it's between 25 and 30% of the total variable cost across most of our systems, and that's true for this is Narrabri, the Narrabri site. Over the 10 years, this is over the 10 years, we spent probably in our higher intensity about $2,000, $3,000 on nitrogen there, a bit more on the higher nutrient system. But still at 20 to 30% of our total costs over the whole period. And so that probably gives us an indication of, well, yep, that's that change in nitrogen pricing. We're really only looking at a total cost on top of the 30% of our total costing. The next graph I'll just jump into pretty quickly is as of, I think I did this one for the GRDC update, right? So this is as of the end of February. This is where our nitrogen pricing was sitting, or maybe I did this the day before my presentation. So the 3rd of March, where we had this quick jump in urea pricing over the weekend after the bombing of Iran, or the US-Israel attack on Iran this time. And you'll see the dotted line here is the average price that we have used in the farming systems data. It's about $768, $64 a tonne for urea versus the spot price that we've seen for urea over the last 2 decades. And so as you can see, for most of the time, the price we're using in our systems analysis is actually higher than the price you'd be seeing. But we have seen this over the last 10 years, let's say, last 5 years in particular, that for the majority of this time, the price we've been using would be below what typical grower has seen. But we use average grain prices too. So we're averaging out both to get our responses. The first way of seeing if there would be any impact in our farming system, or if there is stuff we can do in our farming systems to reduce the impact of end prices, is, are there any systems we've got that have used less? So I'll pull up our major, probably northern region ones that I think would be the most interest to people on this one. We've got a Narrabri site, a Spring Ridge site, and a Pampers site. So Pampers just over the border here in Queensland on the Downs. And we can see, our baseline sites have used, 280 to 400 kilos of nitrogen over that period, plus whatever soil N was there to start with. And they're in our higher intensity systems, we've added an extra 350 to 250 kilos in most of those. Some of these we've had failed crops, which has reduced the actual total N needed because you couldn't plant a crop. Our higher legume systems, we have reduced the nitrogen requirement slightly, but this is, just to bear in mind, this is 10 years of data. So 16 kilos of nitrogen less over 10 years at Narrabri, 50 kilos less at Spring Ridge over 10 years. The only really big significant one here is Pampers, and I'm going to dive into that one because it's reduced the nitrogen requirement, but the reasons for that probably don't support the system. And we've also got this lower intensity system where we've got, we have managed to reduce the nitrogen requirement over the 10 years, but not by a huge amount, 50, 130 and 31 kilos respectively at Narrabri, Spring Ridge and Pampers. And I guess the straightforward answer for this is nitrogen is it's a factor of demand. So it's a factor of the productive potential of our cropping systems. And what that says to us is most of our cropping systems, no matter what crop we're growing, have a fairly similar productive potential. And, you know, sometimes we might grow a higher legume crop, and that'll remove the need for nitrogen the year it's grown, but it doesn't necessarily reduce the system demand for nitrogen. So I'll just go forward here, and I'm just going to go straight into that Pampas one here, where we've got, you know, a higher legume system saying we can, you know, reduce our requirements by 270 kilos. And what I can see from the data is in winter 2021, we were basically even in terms of how much nitrogen had been applied, or what the difference in nitrogen requirements had been. And then in summer of 2021, the higher legume system had a mung bean, and the sorghum we had a sorghum in the baseline. So there's 120 kilos of N difference. But the next part of that difference is because we had a mung bean, we didn't get the stored water for the winter follow-up double crop, whereas in the baseline system we did. So we missed 116 kilos there. And then because we didn't have a crop in that winter 21 or 22 winter, 22 summer, we've actually got a long fallow in that high legume system, which has saved us a bit more to the wheat. So if we go back to that figure of, you know, we've saved 270 odd kilos of nitrogen, well, 120, that's great, that's fine. We've grown a legume instead of a cereal crop. But 120 of it here is that we didn't grow a crop, so we have a missed cropping opportunity. And then 60 of it here is, or 70 of it here is a long fallow effect. So essentially, if we, you know, had been able to crop, we probably don't get this saving here, and then we probably also don't get the long fallow. So we've, you know, you can reduce your nitrogen by not planting a crop, but probably not the ideal way to make a profit going forwards. This chart here is, so $768 a tonne is the price that we'd used long term for the urea pricing for our farming systems project. The bars here are saying, what if it was $1,300 a tonne every single year? So for the 10 years of our farming systems data, and this is just the Pampas site I'll start with. And you can see the average annual gross margin, you know, declines. That's probably expected, but there's none of those jump out to me as being significantly worse than the others. And that's the Pampas site. You know, we've probably dropped, you know, $80 a hectare per year across most, maybe a little bit more in some of the higher intensity and high nutrient systems, but nothing that you'd go, yep, that one's clearly better. If I jump to Narrabri, now very similar story, slightly higher differences in our high nutrient and high intensity. So we've probably dropped $100 a hectare versus our you know, $50 a hectare in our baseline and maybe $100 a hectare in higher intensity. But if you just look at the ranking of those blue lines, so the black lines is at 768 and the blue lines are at 1300 for urea. If we were to rank those systems in terms of profitability or gross margin per year, you know, the system that's number one at $768 a tonne is lower intensity than higher intensity and then our baseline. When we move to $1,300 a tonne, lower intensity, higher intensity, baseline are our top three. So it doesn't change our system ranking, that change in nitrogen pricing. And I think to dive into why that's the case, it's that we haven't had many differences in crop between those. So, you know, our higher intensity systems, I don't have the higher intensity on this one. At the higher legume systems at most of these sites have had a similar number of legumes to our baseline system. So we're already fairly high in legume inclusion in our baseline farming systems. So we're just looking here. Here's a Narrabri, some 9 crops over the 10 years in our baseline, 4 of which were chickpea. And then in the higher legume system, yeah, we've swapped to some faba beans, so higher biomass, but we've only got 1 more legume crop over 10 years. Similarly, at Spring Ridge, we've got a couple of chickpea crops in our baseline, and we've got a chickpea and 2 fabas in our higher legume crop. So over 10 years, even our higher legume systems, we're really only talking 1 extra to legume crop. In our lower intensity systems, the big driver of this is what we've seen is the introduction of cotton. And so whilst we've had less nitrogen demand, and I won't go back to the exact numbers for those, we've had 4 and 5 crops respectively in 10 years. At the Narrabri site, as I showed in the previous slide, the lower intensity system is the most profitable system. However, the reason for that is 1 crop in 10 years. There's 1 crop at the Narrabri site which returned $6,000 a hectare gross margin in the year it was grown, and that equates for 63% of the return over 10 years. So a lot of the risk in our lower intensity system, we take out the production risk. So we do a really good there. We make sure we've got the water, but we sort of concentrate our risk in pricing, in hail, fire, all the other effects sort of get a bit concentrated in it. So if we're relying on 1 good crop in 10 years to carry our production system going forward, there's risks to that too. So, and I guess unfortunately the takeaway from all of this is that, compared to the baseline, I won't go to the takeaway yet. Compared to the baseline, most of our baseline systems, our best crop accounts for 20 to 25% of our overall performance over 10 years. Spring Ridge and Pampas and Narrabri. So that's our downside to our lower intensity systems. But I guess the summary, the takeaway of it all is that our nitrogen requirements are driven strongly by yield potential. So if we simply got yield potential, it's not going to matter what crop types or things we're growing, other than legumes being grown. In the year of them being grown, they will save the nitrogen requirement. However, if you are putting them onto a paddock that's got reasonable starting N, you often mine that N first. So the difference post legume and post cereal crop, we've often seen the case where the legume is lower than the wheat going into the next planting. We have seen the reverse too. We've got a whole range of results, so it's hard to say that there'll be any savings for the following crop. And whilst we do have our lower input systems can reduce input costs and have smaller declines in profitability from nitrogen pricing, the overall system ranking by profitability doesn't really change based on nitrogen pricing. It's still being driven really by yield and grain price until a point where nitrogen is no longer worth putting on. And that'll do me. So thanks everyone. And if you've got any questions, let me know.
Great. Thanks so much, James. If there's any questions, as we mentioned, please pop them in the chat. And we can ask those. We can ask one now, or we can ask it at the end. So thank you very much, James. It doesn't appear to be any questions, so we might move on to our next speaker. So up next, we do have Cameron Leckie. So Cameron is the Regional Soils Coordinator for the Southern Queensland, Northern New South Wales Drought Resilience and Innovation Hub. So his role is to facilitate the implementation of the National Soil Strategy. Cameron is an agricultural engineer and a PhD student investigating the spatial variability of infiltration. He's also an accredited registered soil practitioner. And today he'll be taking us through an analysis on the impact of urea availability and pricing on yield and gross margin using CropARM. I will pass over to Cameron now.
Great, thanks, Lana. Can you hear me?
All good.
And you can see the slide?
We sure can.
No worries, I'll get into it. Okay, thanks for the opportunity to present today. So what I'm going to do is give a overview of a tool called CropARM, which is a decision support tool to help people make decisions. And I guess given the uncertainty we face, hopefully this will be a useful tool for people to use. It's one tool out of a suite of tools that are available at ARM online. So that's the Agricultural Risk Management online. If you type in CropARM into Google, it'll come up, and I think Lana's going to put the link in as well into the chat. And as the tools themselves have been co-developed by the University of Southern Queensland and the Queensland Government and funded by the Future Drought Fund. Okay, so what I'm going to do is provide an overview of CropARM, so how to use the tool. Then we'll go and have a look at a few scenarios, and I just want to highlight that we're looking at a scenario, not predictions. And I guess the ultimate aim out of this will be, if you think it'll be useful, you go and crunch your own numbers to help make decisions. So this is just basically give a bit of an overview and a couple of scenarios, but it's obviously based on a specific location and specific circumstances. So please don't take the numbers I'm putting up here and apply them to your own system without actually looking at your own numbers. So I've got a couple of scenarios there. And yeah, basically the idea is that you're being shown about this tool, and if it's useful, you can go forward and use that to help facilitate your own decision making. So just a brief overview of CropARM. So as I said, it's a decision support tool. The modelling behind it's based on APSIM, or the Agricultural Production System Simulator, which has been around quite a while, and it's used a lot in scientific research for broadacre crops. It's a collaborative project that includes a number of Australian universities, also I think New Zealand and US universities are also involved. But because it's a scientific tool, it's not particularly easy for lay people to use. So what CropARM does is provide a front end to the APSIM, makes it easy for people to use. There's 58 sites Australia-wide for a range of broadacre crops that are available in CropARM. And it gives you the ability to analyse scenarios. So you can model a range of agronomic decisions. We'll see in the next couple of slides what that includes, and it has a range of outputs. So I'm going to be talking about yield and gross margin today, but there's a number of other things you could do, such as residual nitrogen, residual moisture content, etc. Lana, I think, has just put the link up for ARM online, and hopefully it is easy to use. Now, I do need to at least one person's had trouble when they've clicked on the ARM online link. It's come up with basically a warning on their browser. If you do come up with that problem, you just need to clear your browser cache, and that should remove that problem. The actual tool's working, and most people don't have problems with accessing, but we have noticed a couple of people have that. So you just need to clear your cache on your browser if that's a problem. Okay, so once you get into CropARM, this is the first page that you have. So you can see there's all the states and territories, with the exception of the ACT. You pick your location and then hit next. So what we're going to do is look at a scenario based in Narrabri. And of course, only 58 sites. So if where you're physically located is not necessarily represented, just try to find somewhere that's relatively close to use. And then next step is you select your soil type. So it gives you a range of soil types, and for Narrabri, it's all based on vertisols and different plant available water capacity. So what we've selected here is sort of the mid-range, 190 millimetres of available water capacity. But I guess if you've got shallower soils or you've got dispersive soils, you'd probably be at the lower end. If you've got nice deep soils, not a lot of acidicity or dispersion, then you might go the larger end. And we actually did a bit of a webinar not too long ago on plant available water capacity, which if you're interested, Lana should be able to share for you. The next slide is where you start putting in your agronomic decisions. So first thing obviously is what crop you're going to grow. So I've just selected wheat, and you can see the crops that are available for wheat, so in Narrabri. So not all crops are available in all regions. So if you're in Kingaroy, you can add peanuts, but you can't put peanuts in Narrabri. So it's basically the key crops in each of in each region are what's included, not all crops. Obviously, try and make it relevant. Then you can put your initial soil nitrogen, your initial water content, what cultivar you're using, seed, range of sowing dates, plant density, how much nitrogen you're putting in, and there's a couple of things, the side dressing and row spacing, which you can't actually choose. But so you can see they're the major inputs or options that you're looking at for your scenarios. And each time you select more than one, you're creating another scenario. So for example, you can see here what we're looking at is different amounts of nitrogen applied at sowing, and we've actually got 5 scenarios. So what's going to happen is we'll have 5 different bar charts come up to allow us to compare the scenarios. And we're focusing on nitrogen here because obviously that's the topic of the day. But in other times, you might be looking at, how much water you've got available, what your soil test results have about your initial nitrogen, if you want to plant at different times. So depending on, what's guiding your decision making at any particular time, you can tailor the scenarios towards that. But as I said, we're going to focus on nitrogen. So you've done that, you basically press run and it comes up with the results. So I'll just briefly explain this before we get into it. So obviously the key part is you can see that the box plots. What do the box plots represent? I guess you've got the upper and lower bars. So you can see, hang on, I'll bring the pointer up. That you saw your upper part of the box plot, that gives you sort of the maximum expected yield in this case. And then at the bottom end is what you'd expect to be the lowest yield. The blue box, that represents 50% of the outcome. So basically it runs a whole bunch of scenarios based on historical data and climate data, etc., and comes up with a range of scenarios. So you've got your best case, your worst case, and then the blue box represents about 50% or half of the outcome. So that's where more often than not, the result will be in there somewhere. And the black line is the median, so the middle value, and the red line is the mean. So I've based basically the results on the median values. And what we can see, we've got the different nitrogen rates. So starting from 25 kilograms up to 150 kilograms of nitrogen. So that's not urea, that's actual nitrogen. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And you can see as you increase the nitrogen rate, as you would expect, we see yield increases. But we also see that the bars get bigger. So there's more uncertainty. At 150 kilograms of nitrogen, yes, you're getting more yield, and you expect to get a lot more than at 25 kilograms, but you can also see the uncertainty is also greater. So that's what we're looking at with the box plots, and then you can change up the top. So if you want to look at different properties, for example, how much moisture you got left at the end of the cropping season, you can do that. And then we got these other options for analysis. So you can look at selected seasons, so particularly wet or dry seasons, and gross margin, which is really what we're going to look at here. So for the gross margin scenario, so yield's obviously important, but at the end of the day, it's gross margin, which is the most important. So we've got 4 scenarios. Basically, we've got a baseline scenario for both diesel and urea pricing, and then a high diesel and high urea pricing. So the baseline for urea, we put $750 a tonne, and then we doubled that for urea at $1,500 a tonne as the high. And then for our OVC, that's other variable cost. For wheat, we went with $500 per hectare. And for the high, we just basically multiplied that by 1.5. So it's the high diesel case. Now, you can't specifically put the diesel price in, but obviously diesel and energy is related to pretty much all of our inputs. So we just made a multiplier here of 1.5. Whether that's right, wrong, too high, too low, time will tell, but it's just, we need something to gauge our scenarios off. The actual cost we got from the Ag Margins database, and I use Gundawindi because Ag Margins is actually a Queensland tool, and Gundawindi is obviously the closest on the border there to New South Wales. And with urea, 46% of urea is nitrogen, so that's where we can calculate that 100 kilograms of nitrogen is the equivalent of 217 kilograms of urea, and we use the latest wheat price from ABARES. So let's look at the scenario results. No surprise, as you increase your nitrogen rate, your yield, also your gross margin increases. But what we can see is there's greater uncertainty as we get with the larger amounts of nitrogen. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so as the nitrogen rate increases, we get a greater gross margin. I guess the question is, if our supply of urea is limited, should you apply less or should you plant less? And so from this data, what I've done is based on a sort of, if you could get 100 tonnes of nitrogen, I've just used that as an easy figure. If you've got 100 tonnes of nitrogen, of urea, we know how much nitrogen's in that. We know our application rates. We can actually work out how many hectares we can spread that over. So if you want to put 25 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare down, you could cover almost 2,000 hectares. If you wanted to put the top rate at 150 kilograms of nitrogen on, we'd only be able to cover about 300 hectares. And obviously, in the intermediate ranges, if you put the urea rates in somewhere in between. And then because we've got our gross margin, we can actually work out, what's the best outcome here. And you can see that 25 kilograms has the lowest gross margin. At 150 kilograms, it's the second lowest gross margin. So what this indicates is going too much nitrogen, you're actually going to go backwards. But the sweet spot appears to be about 75 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and the limited difference between 50 or 100. So this gives you a bit of an idea. If you are limited by nitrogen, you can use this tool and the data to help you work out where's your sweet spot for making the most effective use of what urea you do have available. Okay, so that was just one on the base scenario. So the base cost for urea and our diesel-based other variable costs. So let's look at what happens if we change the cost structures. So I've got 4 different cost structures. So our base urea and diesel prices, base urea plus high diesel, high urea at base diesel cost, and then high urea and high diesel costs. And you can see there the different gross margins per hectare. The median gross margin for the best outcome, so that's our base cost for urea and diesel in these scenarios, just over $900 per hectare. And even the worst case, it's still over $500 a hectare. Obviously, quite a considerable difference between the best and worst case. And if it's depending on what happens with diesel prices, urea prices in sort of in between, you can see obviously it's a bit higher than the worst case. But the aim here is to give you some ways of thinking about what happens with different price scenarios, and at what point do I need to what decisions should I make based on likely or possible scenarios. Now, unfortunately, yesterday when we were finalising this, there's a little bit of a glitch with the chickpea, only chickpea in CropARM. So I haven't actually used the CropARM tool for chickpea. Every other crop's fine, but there's a little bit of a glitch, and I didn't want to mislead anyone. So what I've done is just worked out on the average yield for New South Wales of chickpea at 2.2 tonnes per hectare, and the current price. Here's a similar sort of scenario. So I've just done it by calculations rather than using CropARM. So in the base case, you can see the end result is a gross margin of $300, or a bit over $300 per hectare. And in the high case, so that's high diesel and high urea costs, you basically, it won't be urea because I'm not applying urea in this scenario, but just based on the high diesel cost, that there's pretty marginal, if not negative, returns for chickpea. So sorry, I guess the key point here is there's no urea applied here in the chickpea system, but it just shows that chickpea, based on this scenario, is more vulnerable, I guess, to the higher prices than what the wheat was, and because everything else is being kept the same. I guess another option is we go a winter fallow into a summer sorghum. So I've done the same scenario. Full bucket, assuming full bucket, what the initial soil N rates are, planting September, and putting 100 kilograms of nitrogen again at planting. The other variable costs are slightly different for sorghum compared to wheat, but we applied the same multiplier. So the base case for variable costs $900 a hectare, and times that by 1.5, you get the $1,350. The urea prices are the same. Okay, so then we look at the gross margin. So the same sort of calculation and the same 4 scenarios. So the base scenario is $700 a hectare gross margin. And then the high cost, we're sort of getting a bit marginal, about $96 per hectare. Quite a large difference there, and the potential for negative returns. And I guess the other things this doesn't consider is any fallow management cost for your winter season, and then also the foregone income from putting a winter crop in. Okay, and I guess, I saw James put up a comment there. I'll put this all, obviously, variable moisture content situations across the region. I did all these scenarios based on, a full bucket of water, but if you are going to use a tool, you sort of make your initial moisture content based on your current circumstances. So in summary, CropARM is a decision support tool. So the aim is to reduce the uncertainty in your decision making, and obviously at the moment there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. It enables you to create a whole bunch of scenarios, tailored to your situation, looking at different crops, different price structures. So depending on what happens with different prices for urea and diesel overall. And I guess, what I'd encourage people to do is, look at what you think the best case in your circumstances, what you think the best case might be, what you think the worst case might be, and try to work out your decision point so you can minimise your risk. So at what point do you think, no, it's not worth putting a crop in? Or what point up to do you think, yeah, I'm going to go ahead with my crop this season? I guess, one of the inputs into the CropARM model is your initial soil nitrogen. So if you haven't had any soil nitrogen testing done this season, it might be handy to get that in as soon as you can, and probably look at both top and subsoil, so you've got, that other key piece of information when it comes to your decision making. And I'm and the team will be more than willing to help. So if anybody wants to, have a run through with CropARM after this, I'm more than happy to help, go through that to, assist you in making decisions in the coming season. And that ends my presentation. Thanks, Lana.
Great. Thanks so much, Cameron. I've put a couple of links in the chat following on from Cameron's presentation. So as he mentioned, there's the CropARM link in there, as well as a GRDC link too. So there was a question in the chat around, what level of residual nitrogen you'd require if you're sowing with low upfront starter fertiliser. And James has come on and answered that. But James, did you want to add anything to that or add some context around that that answer before we move on?
No, I think the answer speaks for itself, which is, a lot of our farming in the northern region, where we're stored moisture system, to get access to the N has to move to where the plants are getting water. So a lot of Mike Bell's work and Newey's work this year is showing, the earlier we put it on, the more chance we give nitrogen to move. So if we're relying on a late end top-up strategy, we're relying on having that in-season rainfall, one to start the process to transform that urea into a form that the plant can take up, which takes about 2 weeks. But also we're just relying on getting that rainfall at the time we want it to access it. And we've seen even late or even early fallow applied nitrogen in years where we've had basically no rainfall after fallow applied nitrogen or fallow applied urea. We had really low take-ups, like 10% take-up of fallow applied urea. So in those seasons, we're just reliant on what's in the soil already. If we get a perfect season for nitrogen, we can get recoveries of 80% of what's been applied in year. So it's really hard to say, yep, you've got 100 kilos of starting soil in, you'll be able to top up later on, go for it. We just don't know what the season's going to bring for us. So it's always that balancing act.
Great. Thank you, James. All right, I will introduce our next speaker coming up. We have Bill Manning. So Bill is a part of Local Land Services, and he's been working in cropping and pasture production for a number of years on soil capability, faba bean production and soil water mapping. And so Bill today will be presenting on nitrogen efficiency. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, thanks everybody. I just thought I'd just take a step back from some of the higher level stuff and just look at some basics of nitrogen, and in particular looking at using, just having a little bit of problems there. Just looking at nitrogen, looking at going back to a few of our basics, as some of our speakers have alluded to, like nitrogen's a fairly complex beast, undergoes many transformations and reactions in the soil. As James just mentioned then, it is soluble, it moves, it's required in very large amounts for cropping, and this makes the management of nitrogen a bit more complicated than for some other nutrients. This year, obviously, the high-end prices justify more time and management input. Today, I'd like to concentrate on just two basic aspects of nitrogen management, and that is using yield and protein records to allow the prediction of your native end supply from the soil, and also some of the potential routes through which nitrogen can be lost from our system. So our crops we've grown in the past are perhaps our best nitrogen test. There was some discussion previously of doing soil tests for nitrogen, and that certainly has its place. But our previous crops can tell us a lot about the nitrogen status of our soil. If we use an example of a crop that's yielded 3 tonnes at about 13% protein, we can use that to predict how much nitrogen has actually turned up in that grain, and that equation is yield times protein times 1.75, which just is a conversion factor that converts that grain protein content into kilos of nitrogen. And as we know, nitrogen is a key component of grain protein.
Bill, can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Yep.
I can see your first slide only.
Okay. Yep. Well, I can't explain that, sorry. Yep. We seem to be having a bit of a technical difficulty. Yeah, we did try that previously.
Lana, I can move it forward on my screen, and it's got a button down the bottom, live sync to presenter.
I think we're good now. Thanks, Cameron.
Is that any good?
Yep, that's great. Thanks,
okay.
Bill.
Whether I can progress through my slides now, I'm not sure. But anyway, so if we get to that 70 kilos contained in that grain, we then ask the question, how do we get that nitrogen out of the soil? Crops can't get all the nitrogen out of the soil. They use it with less efficiency than 100%, as James mentioned. As the amount of nitrogen or nitrate in the soil increases, the crop tends to start to suffer from an insufficient moisture content to get all that N out. So some of that N gets left behind. And that's why at higher grain proteins, our nitrogen use efficiency tends to go down, because simply the crop doesn't have enough water to use all that nitrogen efficiently. And as that happens, it tends to pack more of that nitrogen into grain protein, which is why our efficiency goes down. So at a 13% protein, reasonably high protein, the crop has to see about 2.5 times as much N in the soil as it puts into the grain. As you go down in protein, the crop can use that nitrogen a little bit more efficiency. So at 11% protein, it needs to see about twice what's in the grain. And noting also that if you're down at 11% protein, your crop is probably suffering N deficiency, i.e. it has insufficient N to use all of its water. But if we look at that example, 3 tonnes at 13%, using our 2.5 times factor, the crop's got to see about 170 kilos of N to achieve that yield and protein. If you can go back and look at your paddock records then, if you put on 100 kilos of nitrogen to get that yield, well, you know that the crop's seen 170 kilos of nitrogen. You've put on 100 of that. So the native soil must have produced about 70 kilos of that via mineralisation during the fallow and during the crop. This is a great system. When does it not work? After droughts and floods and failed crops, the system breaks down a bit. It's hard to know how much nitrogen was actually used in those scenarios. You can find that more was left behind. If you've had floods or waterlogged fallows, you can lose nitrogen. And we would suggest that after these events, use of soil testing, despite the fact that it's fairly time consuming, can be very useful. We'll just look quickly at some of the routes by which we can lose nitrogen. The first point is plants take up their N as nitrate mostly. They take up some ammonium, but most of it's as nitrate. If we look at our common sort of fertilizers, urea, sulfate of ammonia, they have to be converted to nitrate before they can be absorbed by the crop. This involves the production of ammonium as an intermediate step. And ammonium exists in equilibrium with ammonia gas, perhaps in the same way as water and water vapour exist in equilibrium. The problem with ammonia gas is that it can be lost to the atmosphere. So this is the point at which volatilisation can occur, where our nitrogen can be lost to the atmosphere as a gas. Urea is a bit of a special case in that it has to undergo hydrolysis first before it can enter that pathway of conversion to nitrate. And the issue with hydrolysis is that it increases soil pH, makes the soil more alkaline in the vicinity of that urea fertiliser, and that higher pH pushes the ammonium towards ammonia gas, and that's why our urea presents a higher volatilisation risk. So that's sort of the basics of volatilisation, which you'll hear a lot of discussion, and as James mentioned, for growers that might be going towards a post-sowing nitrogen strategy this year, particularly with predictions of lower rainfall, that could be a potential loss of nitrogen. Factors that affect volatilisation: high clay soils have a high buffering capacity. They can resist that tendency for hydrolysis to increase pH. And rain that can push urea into the soil will put all that process in contact with the clay in the soil, and that clay can reduce that pH change, which can reduce volatilisation, and it can also allow that ammonium to bind to the clay, which which further slows that volatilisation process. In general, volatilisation is increased by higher pH. We talk about higher pH soils in the northern cropping zone being a higher risk, but remember those higher pH soils also have a higher buffering capacity, and they also have a higher clay content to bind onto ammonium. Wind will strip away the ammonia gas, and just encourage more production. And also temperature, pretty much all our soil processes speed up at higher temperatures. So a high volatilisation loss scenario would be a higher pH soil, windy conditions, little ground cover to slow the wind at the soil surface, and higher temperatures. Losses by volatilisation can also be increased on lower clay soils and lower pH buffering. Our other main source of losses can be denitrification. When soils become depleted in oxygen levels, as occurs after waterlogging, the microbes still need oxygen for their metabolism, and they can get that from our soil nitrate instead of oxygen. This process requires organic matter for energy for the microbes, and higher temperatures will also speed it up. This process can result in the production of various types of nitrogen gases, dinitrogen, nitrogen oxide, nitrogen dioxide. These are all gases that can be lost to the atmosphere. Mostly in the north, we don't see a lot of denitrification, but at times, if the weather turns against us, it can be a source of loss. The largest losses, the risk scenario is after application of nitrogen, but before the crops have been able to take up that nitrogen. And that sort of follows on to a bit of a scenario through the season. In the fallow and in the early crop growth stages, your soil moisture tends to be high because you've fallowed the paddock. Your crop's not using a lot of water yet. In that scenario, you don't need as much rain to cause that waterlogging. And your soil nitrate can also be high from fertiliser application and fallow mineralisation, which means you've got nitrate there that can be lost. As your crop grows, it uses that water and nitrification, and the denitrification risk probably falls to some degree, but your risk can then become volatilisation from in-crop urea. That's pretty much what I've got to say. Our other source of loss can be leaching, but in our high clay soils that tend to hold on to water and nutrients, that tends to be a lower source of losses for us. And that's pretty much my bit. Apologies for the PowerPoint problems.
No problem. Thanks very much, Bill. Pop any questions in the chat, as I mentioned. We did have one, I think, for yourself, Cameron, from Casey, about if people are unsure about what figures to enter initially into CropARM. Can you answer that one for me?
Sure. Thanks, Casey. Well, I mean, I guess you should have a pretty reasonable understanding of your moisture levels based on recent rainfall and you know, whether you're growing a crop or whatever. So yeah, and it's probably best to go a bit conservative rather than as far as, you know, think it's drier rather than wetter, is what my advice would be. And you know, a metal rod to see how far you got moisture down to if you're unsure. So I think that's for moisture, it's relatively easy. I guess if for nitrogen, I mean, Bill gave a bit of a process there for working out how much nitrogen, you know, previous crops have used. If you've got any previous soil test results, that might be useful as well. And I guess, yeah, once again, I'd probably go conservative rather than when it comes to your estimates, because that way you're looking sort of at your worst case. And if you've got more than what you think you have, then, that's great. Whereas if you go more, a larger initial nitrogen level, you're probably more likely to be disappointed if you've got less than what you thought you had. So I just suggest basically use conservative value if you're unsure.
Great, thanks, Cameron. Another question too. So if you need to test for N in your paddock, where in the paddock and at what depths do you test? And is there any packaging you need to be aware of when sending off those tests?
Yeah.
You definitely need to, test all areas of the paddock. If you've got a variable paddock, cut it into different sections. You need to test to the extent of root extraction, which can be variable. If you test to 90 centimetres, you're probably going to cover the vast bulk of the extraction. If you can go a little bit deeper, that's better. If you can test closer to application, that's better, because you'll pick up a bit more of that fallow mineralisation. Remember that even in dry times like now, if you have stored moisture, the microbes will still be ticking away at depth, mineralising a little bit of nitrogen, probably not mineralising much at the surface. Air dry your samples so that mineralisation stops after you sample. I think, was that the extent of their questions? Was there anything else?
We do have another one, but Cameron, do you have anything else to add in relation to the soil testing question?
I think Bill covered it.
Right. Okay. We do have another one in the chat, and I'll put it to all the presenters. So, how will alternate sources of N be impacted by the current decisions? Is that a feasible option for growers for the next winter cropping season and next summer? What else do you need to know about using the other options?
Probably not my area.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of other, sort of synthetics are going to be affected. So I can see, I think I saw today or yesterday that China's and in Russia's started to cease exports of certain fertilizers. So urea is obviously, because we gain most of it from the Persian Gulf, is what we're focused on here. But I think sourcing other fertilizers could be equally challenging, given that a lot of the major producers are putting export restrictions on as we speak. James, you got anything to add?
Look, not really. Any of the I guess biological ones, I'd want to see some proof if that's what's being touted. Often the science behind them isn't as strong as they might claim.
I could well imagine there might be a bit of a rush of additives, biological additives to fix N.
Yeah. I mean, we know pulses will fix N if they're put into a low N environment. But I think the gist or the long part of that, what will the decisions of this year mean to future years? I think that is probably a really important question, because if we're deciding to cut back our N rates this year, the research shows that we don't recover most of our N in the year it's applied. We sort of recover 20 to 40% of it typically, and then in the next year we'll recover the next half of it. So that's a pretty average thing. We see variations in that, but that's sort of average response. We don't recover it all in the year of application, but we don't lose it either. It carries on to the following year. So if we're making decisions this year based on prices this year, that's likely to have impacts on next year's crop, because we're not going to have the carryover N if we're cutting N rates, or if we can't source the N. So that's going to have the same thing. And equally, if we're going more pulses this year, if we're growing more pulses this year, we're chucking an extra 20% of pegs to pulse. If the price for chickpeas goes to, we're thinking low prices for chickpeas this year, just based on India having a good monsoon season, right? So they got big supplies, lower prices for chickpea this year. If chickpea prices go to $1,400 a tonne next year, or $1,200 a tonne next year, and we've put in an extra 20% of our program to chickpeas this year, well, we don't want to go chickpea on chickpea. So there's our, any decision we make this year is going to have flow-on effects for next year.
The benefit of pulse crops is their main end benefit is their nitrogen sparing effect rather than their building up.
Rather than the fixing. That's right.
Yep.
That's in the farming system stuff. That's what we've seen. We've seen the best benefit is that we don't have to apply it in the year they're grown. In the following year, often we've seen no difference between having a cereal the year before or a pulse the year before at planting in terms of soil nitrogen.
They're a useful part of managing nitrogen, but they're not to be seen as, I guess, a source of nitrogen to replace fertilizer. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much for that. It doesn't look to be. Oh, we might have another question in the chat. Oh, it's a comment about the utilisation of urea via foliars. Does Bill or James or Cameron have any comments on that from Sarah in the chat?
I think it's hard to get a lot of nitrogen through the leaf. Yeah. And you might find a fair bit of that foliar goes on. If you're talking about a foliar liquid, I think you'll find it's hard to get a lot through the leaf, and a lot of it might end up on the soil, and then it's really using existing pathways to get into the plant. So, yeah.
Thanks, Bill.
I think it's hard to put on big licks of nitrogen through a liquid foliar application, if that's the question.
Great,
I guess
thanks,
if we
Bill.
look at, we're talking kilograms per hectare for nitrogen, for micronutrients and that, you're looking at milligrams per hectare. So it's like a lot easier to get micronutrients than it is something like nitrogen.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Cameron, and thank you to our presenters today, James, Cameron and Bill. If there's no more specific questions, we will conclude the webinar. There's lots of good links in the chat, lots of good resources there. As I mentioned in the beginning, you'll receive a recording of the webinar. And we will send details too. If you'd like to ask any questions after this webinar of the presenters, we'll send their contact details for you. So thanks again for joining and have a great day.